The Great War is over. A new decade is right on the horizon. So what's next for America? Stick around because that's what we're going to talk about today in Mr. E's classroom. Hey ladies and gentlemen, Mr. E here. We're going to talk about the 1920s today. Specifically, we're going to talk about what caused the booming economy of the 1920s. So grab your pencil and paper and get ready to take some notes. The short and easy answer to this essential question is two things. Number one was the Great War. With the Great War, we had a huge industrial ramp up. Remember things like the War Industries Board selling to both sides. That really helped drive the economy. The second thing isn't quite as obvious, but it's the automobile, the car. It's really kind of what pushed all sorts of new developments in both industry and the economy. I invented nothing new. I simply assembled the discoveries of other men behind whom were centuries of work. Progress happens when all the factors that make for it are ready, and then it is inevitable. Henry Ford said that. Henry Ford is the guy that really drove the big economic boom of the 1920s with this tiny little invention he had called the Model T Ford. Ford isn't the inventor of the automobile, and he really didn't do anything new. What Ford gets the most credit for is by taking all sorts of ideas and putting them together in relatively new and novel ways that really spark off an economic boom in our country. He really puts this idea of mass production to work. The thing that Ford really gets credit for is the automated assembly line. Ford realized that it took a lot more time to build something if one person did the entire process from start to finish. In Ford's factories, one person did one very specific task in the building of his Model T Ford. This is what we call scientific management. Ford used science to come up with the best possible way to produce a product quickly and as cheap as possible while still keeping his workers relatively happy. Ford really set a new standard for the workplace. If you worked for Ford back in the day, you were paid almost $5 a day. This is almost double what the average factory worker was making at the time. Ford also put in place a 40-hour work week. That's kind of the standard we still live by today. Ford understood that if he kept his workers happy, they would be more likely to do a good job. And if he paid them well, they'd be more likely to buy the product that they were building, a car. All this kind of goes to really drive the economy of the 1920s. People see what Ford is doing and they start to copy it. Ford is kind of a new industrialist. He's not one of those super rich, greedy, Gilded Age kind of industrialist that's all about as much money in his pocket as possible. Ford realizes that if he takes a little bit of a cut from his pocket and he gives it back to his workers or puts it back into his factory, in the long run, he'll wind up making a whole lot more money. And it turns out that's exactly what happened. You can get it in any color you want as long as it's black. This is what Ford said about his Model T, the thing that really kind of made his business explode. The thing that was really cool about the Model T was that it was the base. It was kind of like the Lego of cars. You started out with a very basic chassis and engine, and you could design it just about any way you wanted. The Model T was also incredibly cheap. When it was introduced at the beginning of the 1900s, it was about $850. Now, that seems like it would be a whole lot back then, but compared to some of the other car manufacturers, it was a steal. As Ford started implementing some of his new scientific management things like the automated assembly line, prices really started to fall. By 1916, the price had already dropped $500, and by 1927, you could get a brand spanking new Model T
for less than $300. That was cheap. This made ownership of a car something that was possible for just about anybody. Just about anyone could save up to afford a brand new Model T, or at least a good used one. By 1919, less than 10% of Americans owned an automobile. By 1927, around 56% of Americans owned an automobile. This is almost solely credited to Ford and what he was able to do with this invention, the Model T. So how does this one thing, the car, impact the rest of our economy here in the country? Well, in order to build cars, you need all sorts of materials: steel, glass, rubber, etc., etc. The car kind of created growth in all sorts of other industries that fed into the automobile industry. Another big impact that it had was road construction. Now that we have these cars and it's easy to get from one place to another, you need a way to be able to do that. And road construction did a couple things. First of all, it started to connect the country. It made the highway system, but it also created a lot of jobs. There were people needed to build those roads. The automobile also helped really promote a sense of freedom. Before the 1920s, most people never went more than about 50 miles from their house, just because it was a serious endeavor to be able to do that. When the car shows up, people can travel, especially once the new highway system is in place. It also led to the growth of suburbs. You didn't necessarily have to live right next door to where you worked. You could live a little farther away. All you'd have to do is hop in your car and drive to work every morning and then drive home every evening.
So what caused the booming economy of the 1920s? I think the answer is actually pretty simple. Number one, it's the Great War. It really got us off to a great start for the decade. Second big thing to remember is that Henry Ford really changed the way we did business. What with the automated assembly line and starting the use of scientific management in business. And number three, really it was the rise of the automobile that led to a rapid growth in other industries. Without that, we wouldn't have had a booming 20s. There you go, ladies and gentlemen. The booming economy of the 1920s. Hopefully you got great notes, and hopefully you're going to be ready for the quiz when it happens in class. And as always, till next time, remember, don't stop learning.